So CEOs are all very proud of their beautiful application. I'm very pleased with my work. Oh, hang on. My app has just stolen all your contacts. What? This is terrible. Of course we didn't do it. So the embarrassment comes, and perhaps the business risk comes, if the library does very bad things. For those of you working with mobile applications and using mobile applications, what's the worst thing that you can get back from a user? 1 star. 1 star feedback. A mobile app that's got 1 star feedback, how many of you will install voluntarily an app with 1 star feedback? Any of you? No bold testers who want to find the bugs to help the world? No, screw that. We want the 5-star applications on our phones, don't we? So the worst thing we can get back from a user is 1 star feedback. So we need to be careful about what this library does because it represents us, it's part of us, it's intrinsic, it's inherent. And law at the moment, I'm talking about the legal environment, isn't clear about analytics library. For web it is. Web cookies we can block in our web browser. EU law is affecting the whole world. This stupid little message you get every time you visit a website, we use cookies, please, can you click here? That's because of European law that you're clicking on that, on a site in India written by a company in America. So that's how pervasive it is, but mobile is uncharted territory at the moment. So I said that my code calls their code. This is an outline of something called Countly. Countly is wonderful because all their library is open source. So it means I have no doubt about whether it looks at my contacts, because it doesn't. Furthermore, we can study it. So it's quite a nice little library. And here we can see, for Android programmers, you'll recognize onCreate is called when the application's starting. And it does a little bit of initializing. It sets the URL. And it passes in a key, a magic number, the 27 I mentioned earlier on. When the application starts, it starts the shared library. And in my code, I do something and I record an event. I do something else and I record a more structured event that may have data that I care about. So application-specific data. The user liked my product. I can write a little record event for that. Again, with Countly, it's quite nice because their network traffic is also public. They document it. No other company I know of documents this in the analytics libraries of all the companies we work with. And we can see it's basically an HTTP request with a bunch of names and parameters. And this is a JSON-based structure. And this is another example. You see it's passing keys and device IDs and SDK versions and some sort of data about the device. So fairly innocuous stuff. Why do people bother using analytics? Well, quite often they're tying it to experiments. Those of you who visit Google, I assume that most of you use Google, don't you? Google uses experiments every day, and some of you are getting a different version of Google from the others of you. This happens inherently, and it's built into the system of Google. It's built into eBay, Facebook, Bing. All the big companies do this on the web. And you're under what's known as an experiment. And you might be what's called a control, which means that you get the original version, or you might be the experiment. So this is a typical simple A/B experiment. And you don't know that you're an experiment unless you're very observant, because it's just Google, and Google changes things all the time, doesn't it? So we don't really notice or care as long as we get the search results. But they're measuring, using analytics, your success rates. Did they find better results? Did they click faster? Did we return the results faster? Did the user leave our site earlier? And then based on the answers between the control and the experiment, they say, is the experiment better? Are the results better than the control? If they are, we'll let more users use the experiment until eventually everyone uses it. If it doesn't seem to be going so well, then we'll just scale back the experiment and do a new experiment. The important thing about experiments is the experiment is well-founded. We have to be able to trust the data that we get from it. So from an engineering perspective, we shouldn't care whether the experiment does better or worse. We need to understand the experiment has worked properly. We're trying to generate data and learn from data, and this is a testing challenge. I'll just mention a couple of other points. The simple measure is A/B experiments. You have a control and you have a single experiment, but sometimes people do what's called multivariate experiment. They're modifying many things at once, and you may find, if you ever knew this, you'd actually under control of 3 or 4 experiments at the same time, and they use techniques to understand the patterns that they discern from this. Because if you only run one experiment at once, you can move very slowly. whereas multivariate experiments means we can move much faster in terms of gathering the data, providing we understand the data correctly. From a testing perspective, you may have heard of changing one factor at a time, so changing one input but leave everything else the same, or you may know of changing many factors at a time. So I might test on an Android phone with 2.3 installed, and the same phone with Android 2.2 installed, so the same physical hardware, two different versions of the operating system, compare the results. So that's very similar, and we're only changing one thing at once. Or I may say I'll take an iPhone and visit my website, and I'll take a Windows Phone 8 and visit my website. I'm changing everything there. The physical phone is different, the platform's different, the browser's different. But if I can see my website looks reasonably okay in Windows Phone 8 and in an iPhone, perhaps we're good to go. So we're changing many things at once. The anatomy of a controlled experiment is, I've explained most of this, but roughly what happens is we have the control on this side, and then what's known as the treatment is where we're experimenting and sending the results and do the comparisons and do the analysis. And this is just an overview of an experiment, and here all we're doing is we're moving the sign up button from the left to the right, and we're changing the color. So it's a different sign up button, a different position of it, and we want to compare the results. And what we see here, if you can read at the bottom, is we're looking at the click-through rate, and we can see on the left with the red button that we've got 1.2% of the users click through, and on the right we've got 2.8% of users are clicking through. For those of you who understand a little bit about statistics and numbers, and you're comparing a 1.2% click-through rate with a 2.8% click-through rate, that's more than double. More than double is probably statistically significant, and you say, okay, based on this, it looks like it's better to have it in green and on the left, so we'll put it in green and on the left, and maybe our next experiment is to have it red and on the left, and see what that does for a blue one on the left. So we're varying things, and then we continue to do experiment after experiment after experiment. These notes are courtesy of someone called Keith Stobie. Keith Stobie worked at Microsoft for a long time, a real key engineer, and his material is available online, so the links to his papers are down at the bottom. I encourage you to read them if you'd like to look more at A/B experiments. So what should we measure then? Let's look at our software. One of the things that upsets users is the time it takes for things to happen. A slow app is a bad app. How much resources does it use in terms of memory, CPU? Do we care about this? Well, we don't control which devices our users are using, which web browsers, which desktop computers, so perhaps this is useful to us. What about reliability of our code? When we're doing functional testing, we go through it once, twice, 3 times, maybe 4 times, maybe 10 times if you're doing a bit of performance testing or automated testing. How many times do our users go through the same function? 1 million times? 5 million? 10 million? 100 million? 1 billion times? So perhaps this is useful to us to know how often it fails and what the interval is between the failure rates. So we might look at the reliability of it. And then usability, another key factor, particularly for mobile, is look at things like task completion rate. So for those of you who are asked to fill out a feedback form here, which I assume you will be, how many of you actually complete the feedback form? Is it all of you? Is it some of you? Do some of you start the feedback form but not bother finishing it? Well, if you start it and don't bother finishing it, as an organizer, I'd be thinking, what's wrong with the form? Why is it that they're not completing it? Is it because I asked too many questions? Is it because they got bored? Is it because I asked a stupid question and the person just said, screw you, and threw it away because you annoyed them? So we can learn from this sort of data. So calibration then, all important. Do you remember I said 30 users are active at the moment, right at the beginning? Is it really 30? So we need to calibrate then the tools, the things we're using, and we need to calibrate our own understanding and our practices in using analytics. It's one thing to understand the tools. When it says 30, is it really 30? And then we need to look at what we're doing and how the analytics can help improve our work. This is how analytics is implemented. I've mentioned a couple of these points. In mobile and desktop, it's built into our application. In web, we're using a third-party library, and we're either using JavaScript. If you look at Google, the sample code they just generate for you, and it says copy-paste this code, and it's about 5 lines of JavaScript, and essentially it calls some Google library to do everything. Or they use what's known as a 1 pixel. A 1 pixel is something that's so small that we can't see it, but it's requested by the web page, and they record the fact it was requested. And typically at the end of the request, so let's say they're requesting hello.gif, they have a little question mark and query parameters at the end that tells you something about this web browser session. So that's how they get the data when they're using the pixel-based stuff. Web page is permission-based, which means the users can block it. In any web browser, we can block third-party cookies. We can block JavaScript. We can have pop-up blockers that block advertising. I assume most of you use these sort of things just because you get annoyed by the adverts. So we can block anything on the web, including analytics. Because in a mobile app it's built into our application, the user cannot block it. So this is where we get back to the privacy side of it. And it has the equal rights, and it has an independent life, this library. We don't control what it does what the hell it wants to do. So what's inside the library? Here's just some questions. So what's it do for us? Well, it records events. Good. Does it allow me to record the events I want to record? Can I record custom events with my own parameters? Good. But what else does it do? I've given you an example where it might suck out the contacts of the device, but it may also be sending lots and lots of messages that are using the user's bandwidth. And as we know, the bandwidth out here isn't always good. I have a Vodafone 2G SIM, and by heck, it's slow. If I want to do it, things like PayPal times out on me. So it's not that good a service. And if the library is sending all these extra little messages over my internet that I'm paying for, I'm not as happy as a user. So some questions then for us. Oh, and the final point is Latin for saying who actually checks the checkers? Who guards the guards is the Latin term. And this is saying we're using someone else's software. Can we trust them? Do we even know who these people are? Are they even human beings? Is it a Russian mafia gang who've given us a library? It looks like a nice library, but actually it's there to copy out all the credit card details and to spy on the users. And then ask a bunch of questions as a tester. What about offline behavior? The user's in flight mode because you're being nice to me. So you've turned your phones on to flight mode so you don't get any calls coming in. But you're still playing a game in the background. The game's sending analytics events, but they can't be sent over the internet because the internet's not available. So when the internet becomes available in the coffee break, now what? Does the library actually send out the messages, or has it lost them? If it's lost them, how can we measure the numbers accurately on our website? So talked about access to sensitive data, consumption of resources. I talked a little bit about the network, but it can also use the CPU and the memory, and this affects overall our application. And can we control it? Can the user control it? Do we allow the user to say, don't send these messages, I want to remain private? And do we expose this in the user interface to the users? So we may be able to do it in our code, but can the users also do it? What we've discovered in looking at analytics libraries, they now say silly things like, all you have to do is log on to our website and tell us you don't want us to track you, and we won't track you at some point in the future. How many of your users do you think know what analytics is, know what the URL of the website is, know what their unique identifier is in your software that's hidden, and then trust this site to actually do what it's just asked them to do rather than being a spam bot that's stealing their emails to sell their emails onto someone else? So we need to think about the practicality of that. And probably the final thing, which is the only thing that most people think about, is ease of implementation. If you look at any of the analytics libraries, their websites will say, use our library within 5 minutes. Use our library with 1 line of code. They're selling ease of implementation, ease of integration above everything else. And the nice thing is to tell our users what's happening. We use analytics to help improve our application. This data may go to other people. Webs, we see this all the time. Mobile, we don't see any of this. Users don't know anything about it. So we now need to look at validation. We've decided we want to use an analytics library. Good. Pretty graphs come out. Is this useful to us? Can we actually do something with this data? Is the data worth the effort? And we need to consider this carefully, particularly because once you start using a library, it's really hard to change. So who here is a senior manager? Give me a senior manager. You're a senior manager. So the good news is you're a senior manager. And your bonus in, what's it now? It's July. September, your bonus is, if the usage goes up by 20%, you're going to get a 30% bonus. Good, isn't it? It's a lot of money, isn't it? 30% bonus. Sounds like free money. You're my engineer, you've just come to me and said, you know that analytics library we're using? Well, it's doing some bad things. We're not happy with it. We want to change it. And we're going to change it to one that does better things. Your bonus is relying on the old system going up 30%. He's changing the library because of good engineering principles. How do you feel about him changing the library? Well, hang on a sec, because think about it carefully. If the numbers go down, you're not happy, but imagine that he gets the numbers to go up 50%. 50%. That's his super bonus. That's Employee of the Month award you're going to get. So imagine it goes up, you get happy, imagine it goes down, but which is correct? And I know companies that use 3 analytics libraries in one application because they daren't get off the old one, even though they know the old one is broken. Because their company does bonus structures based on the old, crappy, known to be faulty library. Does this sound like software testing again? Oh, yes. We're full of dealing with crappy software that they still launch. So we need to actually make sure it behaves correctly. And when it says 30, is it really 30? My test, by the way, is I start with 1 user. I add the library to my code, and I do 1 request. Does it appear? How long does it take to appear in the beautiful graph? I then have 2 phones, and I run the application here, and I log it here. Do I see 2 active users? Good. 3. Well, if it can do 1, 2, and 3, there's some hope that if I have 4 active users, it might actually show 4. Make sense? So do something simple. That's called testing. Yeah, okay, how many of your companies actually test the analytics libraries? Oh, never mind. So potential pitfalls then. This is the International Declaration of Human Rights. This is Article 12. And it says, no one should be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy. So this is, in theory, worldwide. It works for us. It works for people anywhere in the world. But the software can be tracking you. Some of the analytics libraries, like Google, make a point of saying, if you put any personal data in, A, we'll remove it, and B, we'll close your account. Is that a motivation to put personal data in? Probably not. Because when Google closes your account, that's kind of the end of it, isn't it? Some of the other ones say, we will tell you who your user is and how much money they're going to spend with you. Sound the same? No. Sounds like they're tracking the users. And they have beautiful examples in their source code that says, by the way, you shouldn't do this. This is how to copy the person's username and password in and record it in your analytics library. So it says one thing, don't, and it shows you how to do it. What do you think most people are going to do? Copy, paste, go. So I'd encourage you to think about this, particularly from an ethical perspective. You may be testing software that's written by some company somewhere else in the world. It may be written here, I don't know. Maybe your own software. But in time, it's going to be used by other people. And if we don't care about privacy, then who the hell else is going to bother about it? A bit like your beautiful streets in Bangalore. You know, if people just throw the litter down, no one's going to clean it up. Guess what Bangalore looks like after a while? But your new party's taking over and going to clean up. I read that today on the newspaper, so I'm quite pleased. Because it's a beautiful city, and I would love to see the parks being clean. So this is Kissmetrics. And do you see the little example there? This is from their website, by the way. That's johnsmith@gmail.com. How personal is that? Pretty personal. I'm going to pick on someone, and please forgive me. And I'm going to pick on you if you don't mind. You're a woman, you're using a mobile application, and you happen to have downloaded a beautiful mobile application that tells you, I don't know, restaurants nearby. It's sending out messages every 15 minutes of your GPS location. It knows your name, and unless you pretended you're John Smith, you may have a woman's name.